Good evening. I don't know if anybody saw this, and if you didn't, I'm ratting myself out. But if you did, I'm explaining. I jumped really big a second ago sitting on the front row because my phone started playing something at me, and it felt like it was yelling at me, and I jumped. I jumped like I was getting yelled at by my dad. That's how bad I jumped. It was actually kind of funny. So that gave me a little bit of a laugh. I thought something was kind of funny this morning. Did you notice what Dad's pitch was for the lesson tonight? Did you notice how he pitched it to you? What he said to get you? Me either. Yeah, no, he was telling me I don't really know how to present that, and then he just said, well, we talked about it, and that was his presentation for the lesson tonight, which is fun. You know, sometimes, I'm sure you guys know this about the way I structure the lessons. Sometimes I don't like you knowing where we're going. Like, sometimes I don't really want you to know where we're headed exactly in the lesson by the title, and so that's fun. We're jumping in, going in blind tonight. But we are going to talk about this idea of the God of the gaps. I don't know if you're familiar with this phrase, but it is actually a phrase most often used by atheists to refer to how Christians use or view God. The science guy, not Bill Nye, I think is it Neil deGrasse Tyson? He is very smart in some ways and very clever in other ways. And he was talking about this. Someone said when he discovered dark matter or something like that. I don't remember exactly what they were dealing with, but someone said, now, surely you know that the Christians are going to point to this thing you've discovered and say, well, that's God. And he says, well, that's just another example of the God of the gaps. Because for centuries, Christians have gone to their limit of understanding the world. And after that, they say it must be God, which is really kind of interesting. It seems as though, the atheist argument is you really only use God as an explanation when you can't explain something better yourself. And man, I wish it wasn't as true as it is, but it seems like that's actually a really legitimate accusation against Christians when it comes to the way Christians see the world. If you go way, way back, not even talking about Christians, but just people in general, if you go way, way back, they looked at the thunder and the lightning. And what was that to people in ancient times? Well, plainly, that was God, right? And dare I say, you don't even have to go all the way back to ancient times. I was reading a book, listening to a book. Y'all know I can't read. But I was listening to a book, and it's called The Frontiersman, and it's about a guy in the 1700s who he thinks he killed a man, and then he goes and he becomes this famous frontiersman. Anyway, in the book, they're talking about the birth of a child to this native Indian tribe. And apparently, the Indians believed that you would wait 10 days before you named your child, and in that 10-day waiting period, you would look for some event that happened, and that is how you would know what the child's name was. And so the Indians, for this one particular child, there was a comet that shot across the sky, and that comet is called the Panther, and so they named this child the Panther Moving Across. His name is actually Tecumseh, which is, I think, really cool because Joshua's from Tecumseh. Otherwise, I wouldn't think that was cool at all. But anyway, so this was kind of their idea, was these signs, these mystical things working in the world. That is an act of some other being, right? And that is the way we see. You know what we say now? A comet. Right? An asteroid. I don't know what we actually call them scientifically anymore, but we'd say that's a star, shooting star. We know what that is. We know why it has a tail. We know why it's moving that way. And we no longer see that, like the Indians did, as a sign. That wasn't a sign. It's just an astrological function of nature, right? We don't look at the thunder in awe anymore. Actually, thunder's never not going to be cool, right? When you see one of those that cracks straight across the sky and seems to split the world in half, it is cool. It is awesome, right? It strikes awe in you. But we don't look at the thunder the same way that ancient people did when they see a crack of lightning and go, the gods, or in certain cases, the one God must be angry, must be upset. we see it and we say, well, yeah, this is a thunderstorm. That's what happens. And we know that it happens because of the pressure changes, and we know how these lightnings form, and we know why they strike. And we can't quite tame exactly how or where they strike, but we do understand it, right? No more mystery, no more God. Our gap has gotten smaller, therefore our God has gotten smaller. We do this also with childbirth. There's people often call it the miracle of childbirth. And I think what they're really saying is that there are a lot of things that have to go right for a child to be born. And that is true. It's not a miracle in the biblical sense, but there is still some awe at the fact that humans can create humans. It's an incredible thing. Well, if you read in the pages of the Bible regularly talks about God opening the womb. Right? That God opened the womb. That this was something that God did. And when you think of the understanding of an ancient person, how else do you explain this? There is an act that goes into this, and sometimes it produces a child, and sometimes it does not. And some women cannot have children, but some women have tons. What else can we point to explain this? It must be God opening or choosing not to open the womb of a woman. Well, now we know ovulation cycles, and we understand fertilization process, and we understand gestational periods, and we understand fetal development, and we understand all this stuff. And guess who's not involved in that process anymore? I don't remember the last time I heard someone say, "Thank God for opening the womb of our sister so-and-so." And in fact, it'd make everyone a little bit uncomfortable. I've said womb too much already. Listen, this is we've removed God from this process. Why? Well, because there's no gap anymore. We understand it. We can explain it. There's no need for God to be a part of this anymore. And so in a lot of ways we don't. And when we see women who are dealing with infertility, well, we have our own methods now. We have our own methods of controlling or opening the womb, so to speak, IVF or a number of different medications, which, again, I'm not making a judgment on that whole situation, but I want to draw our attention to the idea that when atheists accuse Christians of having a God who fills in the gaps, they kind of have a case. We have a tendency as humans to fill God in to the spot that we need him. And if we don't need him, well, then we don't fill him into the spot anymore. This produces a lot of problems. This is also not, I guess I don't know if Isaac Newton was a believer or not, but he fell victim to a similar mindset when he was doing his equations of physics. He reached the limits of some of his math equations and is quoted as saying something to the effect of, maybe God steps in at this point and makes it right. Again, I understand how physics works, but now I can't get this to match up, so it must be God. We do this also with creation. I read there was a book, and the guy said that he thinks one of the reasons Christians are so hesitant to the idea of evolution is that in every other case, when science explains something, we remove God from that. And if we are able to explain the creation of the world by scientific measures, there's a fear that we may remove God from that as well. Again, I'm not here making a case about any of this. I'm simply wanting us to see the tendency of humans and Christians especially to remove God when they gain their own knowledge. Right? When we have knowledge, we have a tendency to pull God out of those gaps. As our gaps become smaller, so too does our God. And that's really the problem of this. When we fall victim to this God of the gaps mindset, it limits our God to only being there when we need him. We really only need him to explain this one thing, and so we use him for that until we understand it, and then we don't need him anymore. And before you know it, you have this ever-shrinking God and this ever-expanding knowledge. It's reminiscent of the imagery in that hymn, "More of God and less of me," right? Well, we're going the other way with this God of the gaps idea. It's somehow less of God and more of my own understanding when we fall victim to this mindset. It makes God smaller. It's similar to the problem that arises when you hear people talk about the back pocket Jesus. Y'all know the back pocket Jesus? It's the Jesus that you have right here in your back pocket. And when something goes wrong in your world, you pull him out and pray to him when you need him. And when that's resolved, you put him right back. He's not a permeating part of your life. He's not the Lord who's governing your decisions. Rather, he's just there when you need him and out of your way when you don't. It's the same idea with this God of the gaps situation. It makes God smaller, and it puts you in control of what's going on. So, listen, I would argue most of us wouldn't say this. Most of us wouldn't act this way. But culturally, and I don't know if it's a psychological thing, this is how we tend to function. We also do this, if you think about this in other examples. Let's say there's a story of a family at a restaurant. And while they're at this restaurant, their son takes too big of a bite because, of course they did. They're children, and he chokes and he can't breathe. And just at the right second, this nurse hears that the son is choking, and she runs over and she's able to administer life-saving intervention. And the Christian might look at that and not understand just how could all this? It must be God. And then a couple weeks later, they realize, well, actually, that was her favorite spot. She goes there every day after work, right? Like, if you had been there any evening, she would have been there. In fact, it's not chance. That's where her and her husband met, and she lost him a couple years ago, and she goes there in the evenings to remember. Some kind of explanation comes into play, and suddenly it's not as miraculous, right? You don't even have to be faith-based for this mindset. You say chance, or the universe did this, and when you understand it, no longer chance, no longer the universe, no longer God, because we have a clear understanding now. So what do we do? Because clearly this presents a problem. This mindset that absolutely creeps into our way of thinking in the church presents a really big problem. It shrinks God. It makes him not as powerful. It makes him a tool of ours instead of a Lord of ours. And so what should we do? I think a great place to look is at David. So we're going to look at a couple of examples of David and how he handles this sort of subject, and then we'll wrap it up. Let's start with 1 Samuel 17. 1 Samuel 17, this might be the easiest example to look at for David. This is David and Goliath, right? And so to set the scene, you've got Goliath standing out at the forefront of the army of the Philistines. And for 40 days, he's yelling at the army of Israel, I defy your God, and I defy the armies of Israel. Send out a man to fight me. And the wager is, if I defeat him, you guys will be our slaves. And if he defeats me, then we'll all be your slaves. And the problem with it is that Goliath is a massive human being, like a giant, not one of those guys you see at the store and you're like, oh, that's a big guy, like obscenely big, supposedly over 9 feet tall. He's a champion who's never lost a battle. He's got all of the gear and all of he is an expert at killing, right? Like that would not be a stretch to describe Goliath this way. And so all of the armies of Israel are afraid, and David ends up, he's not even apparently old enough to be conscripted into the army. He's some age beneath that, and so he is back home tending sheep, and his dad sends him in. He says, hey, take your brothers a cheese snack. Yes, a cheese. David was the cheese snack deliverer. That was his actual job here. And he shows up, and he delivers, and then he hears this guy who seems to come out every morning and evening and yell about defying God, and he's a little bit upset about it. Is anyone going to go fight this guy? I'll go fight him. If no one else is going to do it, I'll go do it. And let's pick up and read in verse 33. Verse 32, David says, your servant will go and fight this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth. And he has been a man of war from his youth. He's been doing this as long as you've been alive. That's maybe the way we would say that. Verse 34, but David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Now, Listen, David, by all accounts, this is some slang for all of you that aren't familiar. David, by all accounts, was a dog, all right? He was a warrior. Like, he was ferocious. He was violent. He was that guy, all right? As you read about David, you read about his war and the way that he battled. He was a ferocious warrior. And it's not shocking that a ferocious warrior could take down a bear with a weapon, right? It's not shocking that a ferocious warrior could maybe ward off a lion with certain weapons and expertise. That's not the craziest thing in the world, right? And if David had done these things, it seems well within reason for David to stop after the first half of this comment and say, listen, I've fought lions and I've fought bears and I've killed them. I've done that because he did. But the second part of this is very clear in David's mind. What he is doing is tied intimately, inseparably with what God was doing. God delivered me from the bear and from the lion. What does that mean exactly? Like, we're not told in beautiful detail about David and his encounter with these animals, right? Here's what we know. These are pretty nasty animals. They're pretty ferocious animals, right? And David bested these animals. He slaughtered or fended off these animals. He says God did it with him. Does that mean God swooped in and blew a big gust of wind and protected David from the animals? Well, it doesn't seem like that's what David is talking about. Does that mean that God put a magical force field around David and it was inexplicable how David could have been saved? It doesn't seem like that's what David's talking about. What seems like, from David's very, very simple retelling, what seems like David is saying is David fought off a lion and a bear with his hands. Like, he grabbed it by the beard. I mean, that's what he says. It seems like what David is saying, and yet this very normal and explainable act, David points to God. Right? It's normal. It's explainable. I did it. I meant to grab their beard. It's not like I didn't know what was happening and something came over me. I grabbed it by the beard and I killed it. David knew exactly what happened, and it seems as though he meant to do what he did, and yet he points to God as the driving force that did what he did. All right, let's look at another one. David also points to the Lord giving Goliath into his hand, and he does so in the same way. That it wasn't a matter of David not knowing how to sling a stone. It was a matter of David knowing that if something happened, it's because of God, right? If I can do something, it's a result of God. That doesn't mean David didn't have expertise, and that doesn't mean David was taken over or put into a trance. It means that if something happened, explainable or not, God was the force that made it happen. Secondly, I think this is an interesting example. Look at 2 Samuel 11. Oops. 2 Samuel 11. This is another familiar David story. The story of David, 12, I'm sorry. 2 Samuel 12. By the way, the thing that started playing out loud was 2 Samuel 13. And if you're familiar with that chapter, it will also make you jump. Anyway, so after David has this awful encounter with Bathsheba and with Uriah, where he lusts after Bathsheba, calls her into his home, sleeps with her, gets her pregnant, attempts to bring her husband back from war to sleep with her so that no one will know. When her husband is noble and refuses to go into his home, he gets him drunk, tries again. That doesn't work either, so he sends him back into battle with a death note. David, man after God's own heart. Anyway, so he ends up thinking he's in the clear. He brings Bathsheba in and marries her, and this child that was that they had created together was to be born, right? Anyway, let's pick up in chapter 12, in verse 1. It says, "And the Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him and said to him, there were two men in a certain city, and one rich and the other poor. And the rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought, and he brought it up, and it grew up with him and his children, and he used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd and prepare it for the guest who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. He said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity." And Nathan said to David, "You are the man." All right, like this is that clinching statement to let David know your guilt is known. I want you to think about how a normal king might have responded to this encounter. He got away with it, right? The optics were good. He married this poor widow, this poor military fallen soldier's widow. He just took her. What a good guy, you know? And now they're going to have a kid together. This should be news of to rejoice about. And Nathan shows up and essentially lets him know what you did is known. At the very least, it's known by God. Now, a normal king who didn't see God involved in things might kill the prophet on the spot. Stop the spread, you know? Maybe God knew, but no one else has to. A normal king could have also looked at this and said, yeah, Nathan, I did. I sinned against Bathsheba. I sinned against Uriah. I really did wrong things in this realm. And I can try and make those right. You know, I did marry Bathsheba, and I plan to take care of her, and I'm going to make restitution here. It's interesting. David's response here is, first of all, immediately broken and humbled. And secondly, he sees his sin as being not against Uriah, not against Bathsheba, not against his kingdom as a role model he failed to live up to, but against God specifically. He points, again, to Nathan as not just a human, but as a word of God, a convicting word of God. Not just something to be managed or dealt with, but as truth coming to him through the mouth of the prophet. This is not the normal way kings would respond to this, right? Like, I think because it's a Bible story and because David is the man after God's own heart, we're like, well, of course, he's convicted. This wouldn't convict a lot of kings. They're already in the hole. They'd just keep killing until they were in the clear, for fear of maybe losing their power. David, though, sees this, again, as something brought about by God. Not something that was something to be managed any further, but something that was done by God to convict him. And he's immediately humbled and remorseful towards God. God is the present force in this story for David. Let's look at another one. Let's see how much time we've got. We got a little bit of time. Did y'all think I was concerned about time? Did you know that? I'm conscious of it. Let's look at another one. Look at Psalm 27, and then we'll come back to the Samuels. Psalm 27. David says, Psalm 27 and verse 1, he says, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When evildoers assail me to eat up my flesh, my adversaries and foes, it is they who stumble and fall. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war arise against me, yet I will be confident. One thing I have asked of the Lord that I will... One thing have I asked of the Lord that I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will lift me high upon a rock. And now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me. And I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing and make melody to the Lord. Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud. Be gracious to me and answer me. You have said, seek my face. My heart says to you, your face, O Lord, do I seek. Hide not your face from me. Turn not your servant away in anger. O you who have been my help, cast me not off. Forsake me not, O my God of my salvation. For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me in. Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me on a level path because of my enemies. Give me not up to the will of my adversaries, For false witnesses have risen against me, and they breathe out violence. I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. How involved is God in David's day-to-day affairs here? I mean, he is the protector. He is the decision maker. He is the warrior. He's everything. And you have to remember the situations David found himself in. When David talks about being surrounded by his enemies, literally, I mean, there are times where that is literally what's happening. And in these moments, when he writes at least this Psalm 27, he says, if I make it out of here, when I make it out of here, it's only because of God. We already established David was that guy, all right? David fought himself out of some battles valiantly and impressively. And yet David sees, again, the thing that did that was not merely him, but God acting on his behalf. He calls out to God and asks, don't let my adversaries take me. The implication there is, if they take him, who made that happen? God would have been the driving factor that allowed or made that to happen. That was the way David saw the world. David didn't see the world as things happening that he could understand, but as God moving and doing things all the time, good or perceived bad. This is the way David understood things to work in his world. And I think it's important that even in moments when David is surrounded by enemies and he's crying out for God's deliverance, he understands if deliverance doesn't come, this is God working all the same, good or bad. God gives, God takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. This is David's understanding of the world that he lived in, is that God was everywhere all the time doing things. We also see this in Psalm 23. We're not going to read this right now, but if you remember from our Psalms class, the way that David writes Psalm 23, it's this idea of a shepherd being led to a slaughter, by a sheep being led to the slaughter by a good shepherd. Whether the shepherd is leading it in green pastures or into the slaughter, the shepherd is still good, and the shepherd is still leading. And I think that's, again, indicative of the way David sees this world. One more example from David. Look at 1 Samuel 25. We're going to read all 44 verses. No, we won't read all 44 verses here. There's this guy, Nabal. We're going to skip up to verse 18, but we need to set the stage a little bit. Nabal is, the Bible describes him as a ruthless man. He's very rich, but he is not very nice, right? He has this wife, Abigail, who people respect, but she's also a woman in an ancient culture, so they respect him, and they also kind of respect her. That's sort of the idea here. But people know she's smart, right? Nabal is not smart. Nabal is just rich and mean. So David sends some men over to Nabal's house and says, hey, ask him for some provision and remind him that we've taken care of his people, and it's his turn to sort of return the favor. And so David does. He sends these men over, and these men respond with exactly what David said. Hey, we've been good to you. Can you be good to us? And Nabal says, why would I do that? Like, who is David? No, that's dumb. I'm not giving you stuff. Go away. And so they go back, and they report to David, and they say, he said no. And David's like, seriously? Everyone strap your sword on. Tonight we ride. Right? I mean, like, he says, get your sword, and we're going to take care of this. And so they do. And the plot is death to Nabal. And one of Nabal's servants hears word of this, or he gets wind of this. And so he goes over to Nabal's wife, Abigail, and says, Abigail, David's coming because your dumb husband wouldn't help him. You got to stop him. I don't know what he anticipated Abigail doing, but that's what he does. He says, you got to stop this because he's coming to kill Nabal. And of course, if the ruler is killed, the rest of his stuff is up for grabs, meaning the next person doesn't just get it, right? Everyone in Nabal's care or in Nabal's household would lose what they have. So he brings this up to Abigail, And pick up in verse 18. It says, Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 200 skins of wine and 5 sheep already prepared and 5 seahs of parched grain and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs and laid them on donkeys. And she said to her young men, Go on before me. Behold, I come after you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. So she's going to take care of this with or without her husband's knowing. Preferably without, it seems. Verse 20. And as she rode on the donkey and came down under cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came down towards her, and she met them. Now David had said, Surely in vain have I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, and he has returned me evil for good. God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. Time out. This escalated from killing Nabal to killing Nabal's entire community. Let God do to me what I plan to do if I leave one man alive in his household. So now, stakes have gotten much more serious, all right? 23, when Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, On me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. She shows up and she just says, Listen, blame me. I didn't see them. I would have treated them differently. My husband's an idiot. I mean, that's what she says. That's what she says. Don't punish all of us because he's an idiot, right? As she goes on, she explains a little bit more in David's response, so we can pick up in verse 32. David said to Abigail, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you to me this day. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. Now, who stopped David here? Who does David think stopped David? Well, it's plain to see. You notice, if you go back and you read every word, which we didn't do this time, but if you go back and you read every word, God is not mentioned one time in the working of this plan until David. That's the first time God is mentioned in this action, right? So Nabal rejects offering help to David, and David's servants go back and report, and David gets angry, and they're going to go slaughter the whole camp. And then one of the servants of Nabal gets word, and he goes and tells Abigail, and then Abigail hatches a plan, and she brings an offering, and then she's very humble about it, and she persuades it. Abigail saved Nabal's life, right? Abigail stopped David from slaughtering these people and taking vengeance into his own hand. It was Abigail. And it was Abigail because she got word from a servant. It's easy to see why this happened. And it's easy to see her motivation too, isn't it? I mean, this was an act of self-preservation. This wasn't divine intervention. This was self-preservation. Any of us in Abigail's shoes would have likely done the same thing. This wasn't supernatural. Well, unless you're David. Unless you're David, then you sit there, and even if you know exactly how this all went down, you say, God stopped me. He did it with Abigail. He did it with this very easy to follow. I know how it happened. I can explain why and how it took place. But this was God working, not just Abigail working. David saw the world with no gaps. There was just God. Right? He was a God of much more than the gaps. David understood God to be all over the place all the time. If something happened, God did it. If something was taking place, God allowed it. If something good transpired for David, which he considers Abigail stopping him a good thing, he's grateful that Abigail stopped him from taking vengeance into his own hands. And he says, let God deal with Nabal. And God does. And when Nabal dies, guess what David says? God took care of Nabal. Because David understands the world as not a place that we understand and fill God into the gaps, but a world that God created and is present in and working in all the time. David is called a man after God's own heart. Here's what I think. This is what I think we can learn from David. We have got to see the world through the lens of God. For some reason, we pit the physical versus the spiritual, and we act like they're in conflict with each other. We pit science versus faith, and we act like they're in a battle against each other. If we believe God created the universe through whatever means, we're not having that conversation. If we believe God created the universe, period, the universe is going to point back to God, right? It's not going to be fighting against him and trying to disprove him perpetually. That's just us. David understood God as being the thing that everything pointed back to, the invisible moving force that made everything happen. And because of that, David acted very differently. I think we need to see the world the way that David did. And what I think is funny is we do this with the rain, don't we? As I was thinking of examples of of us doing God of the gaps, I thought, well, the rain. People used to think the rain was from the gods, but that's one that we still do. We pray for the rain, don't we? In a dry season, God send rain. Well, why do we pray for the rain but explain away the womb? Why do we pray for rain but fight with people about the lightning and the thunder? Listen, the same God that sends the rain makes the thunder and the lightning. The same God that opened the womb back then opens the womb now. There are stories of people who didn't know that they could have kids, and then suddenly they have kids. And you know what? We know why scientifically, but you know what I think? I think, yeah, it happened that way. That's how God decided to work when he opened the womb. It's not one or the other. They're not fighting for what is true. It is how the world works, because it is how God works. He created the world to work this way. I was talking to Mom kind of about this concept, and she said something to the effect of, when me, Alexa, and Jana figure out something about her parenting style, when we look back on our childhood and we go, you did this thing this way, and it made us feel this way, and this is why you did it. She goes, yeah, like, exactly right. Understanding the way that the world works, all right, figuring things out scientifically, should not make us go, oh, no need for God anymore. It should have the other effect. Oh, so that's how he chose to do it. Incredible. When you eat an incredible meal and you don't know how they made it, let's say you can't cook, all right? Everything you eat is a wonder. How do people do this, right? But if you can cook and you eat something incredible and you can tell how they did it, they browned the butter beforehand, they reduced it down so that it was a little bit more, had a better texture. Like, you understand something about cooking. You still eat the dish and you say, wow, that's really good, even though you can explain it. I'm using these silly examples to communicate this is how we ought to view God and his work. What he's doing in the world is not explained away because science. What he's doing in the world is still really cool and awesome. He just chose to do it in ways that we can observe sometimes at this point. 1,000 years ago, we couldn't observe it the same way. It didn't make it any less God, and it didn't make it any less awesome. This is how God is working. And so we ought to do the same thing. We ought to see God the way David did. Remember that this is not a battle between physical and spiritual. This is not a battle between science and faith. This is how God works in the world that he created. It's how he chose to do it. And maybe he could have done it other ways, but this is how he did it, and it's beautiful. Just because we understand it shouldn't detract from the beauty or the awesomeness of what God is doing. And last, the challenge, and this is, if you remember the Kingdom Part 2, the lesson on the Kingdom Part 2, this is the same challenge from that lesson. See God. Look for him. He is all over the place. He created the world. Like the VBS song says, his fingerprints are everywhere. God, like, if something happens here, God did it. It's what we understand. And if God didn't do it, I feel like weird saying that, but if God didn't cause that to happen, then God is working through that thing that is happening, like he did over and over and over again with different nations, conquering nations and punishing other nations. God may not have caused, but he's working in this world. And when we can see it, that shouldn't take away from it. So see God. Make an effort to see God in everything that you do. And when we can, I believe this does something for us that's really healthy. First of all, I think it changes the way that you see the world. If what you are seeing is not just some arbitrary act of nature, but a beautiful act of God that we can observe and understand, it should give you an appreciation of who God is and how he is moving. Our God is a God who creates order out of chaos. When we see the order, that should tell us a little bit more about who God is. Secondly, yeah, that's the other thing. It should remind us of who God is. Our God is not an absent father. And yet we paint him that way so often. He's not an absent father. He's an incredibly involved father. A father who cares deeply about his children and their livelihood and their soul and their life and the things going on in the world. And he's here, and he's working, and he's doing above all and through all and in all is the way Paul describes it. He's an engaged, loving father, not an absent, cold-hearted one. And if we see the world the way David sees the world, we're reminded of that every time we see something happen. Lastly, when you see the world this way and you say it out loud, it builds the faith of the people around you. It might make people think you're weird, too, because this is very weird. Like, this is not how we think as Americans, right? But when people see that in you, and they see that you attribute everything to God, that builds the faith of the people around you. Listen, maybe God didn't open up that parking spot for you because you have a bum knee. But maybe he did, you know? If we attribute the little things to God, he becomes much bigger than just a God of the gaps. And so the challenge tonight, see God, see him working, put the glasses on that David has on, where he sees God moving and working all throughout his life. Do this because it changes the way that you see the world. It reminds you of who God is. It builds faith in those around you. And lastly, man, it gives meaning to everything that you're doing. It injects meaning into everything you do. Suddenly, your life is not a meaningless thing waiting for eternity, but it is a thing. Your life, your actions are taking place in the working of God. He could be using you right now to accomplish something. And just because you can explain it doesn't mean he isn't doing it. He is much more. Maybe the lesson should be titled, Much More Than a God of the Gaps. That's probably a better title. People are going to think an atheist preached tonight on YouTube. We'll change that afterwards. But listen, we serve a God who is much more than a God of the gaps. He is, as Paul says, above all and through all and in all. The challenge tonight is for us to see it. And he is no more involved than in the redeeming and the saving of the world. He sent his son to die on the cross for our sins so that he can have us with him for eternity. That's the gospel message. And if you haven't obeyed the gospel tonight, if you haven't heard the gospel tonight, man, we didn't zero in on that tonight. But that is the chief and most obvious way that God is working in the world through Jesus. If you need to know more about that, we'll take your Bible, put it in your hand, and show you what he says. Because we serve a God who loves you and wants you with him. And if you need prayers at the church, you can let us know now as well. Whatever you need, come let us know. We love you and we'll help you. If you'll come forward while we stand and sing.